Yes, here we go. Okay, it's recording. All right, thank you everybody for joining. I shall speak for about half an hour, inshallah ta'ala, and then we can have question and answer, inshallah. I'm just trying to move this up. All right, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Thank you so much for joining us, and inshallah this will be a useful session. As I said, so my topic, inshallah, is on why teachers always mattered. And I guess I wanted to come up with this particular title or heading because with the unfortunate circumstances of COVID-19, we are seeing the significant role that teachers are playing now, but also the healthcare workers. And suddenly there is this surge of information about how great teachers are and how wonderful their work is. And it is absolutely great and it is wonderful. But prior to COVID-19, there was, if you can recall, in fact, often a lot of criticism against teachers, that they're not doing their work, they are not performing, and so on and so forth. And so for me, and I'm sure for all of us, teachers always mattered. And what I want to do today is go through this from perhaps an Islamic perspective. And to begin with, to thank you all for the Prophet ﷺ says, "La yashkurullah man la yashkurun nas." Whoever has not thanked people has not thanked God. So thank you for joining us despite your very busy schedule. And let me start with the couplets of a famous Egyptian poet by the name of Ahmad Shawqi, who any Arab listener would possibly know these couplets. قم للمعلم وفه التبجيل كاد المعلم أن يكون رسولا أعلمت أشرف أو أجل من الذي يبني وينشئ أنفسا وعقولا. Essentially what Shawqi says is that he says, stand up for the teacher, give him or her full honor and respect. Indeed, a teacher could have been a messenger of God. And then, can there be any person nobler than the one who builds and nurtures souls and minds? And if we can pause here for a second and look at the Egyptian poet Ahmad Shawqi, and when did he actually say those words? Ahmad Shawqi presented one of the most famous poems at an event at the Higher Teachers College Club in Cairo. The Egyptian Revolution, which happened soon after World War I, led to the Egyptians' independence from Britain in 1922. It was a very joyful day, as you can imagine, with widespread celebration. And Shawqi recited his poem in a gathering that took place on the cusp of this momentous event. The Arabic poem is 68 lines, and I chose only these lines for you because they pretty much sum up why teachers always mattered. And I will go in more details in this in a second. Now, the poem has 68 lines, and it talks about three fundamental points. One, it exalts knowledge and teachers. But secondly, and importantly, and I want you to reflect on the present context as we are speaking about these points. Secondly, it laments the current state to which learning has developed in his land. And thirdly, it describes the enormous responsibility of teachers to inculcate knowledge as well as values in the next generation. And then there are three key themes that emerge in his poem. First, and importantly for our discussion today, is praise for selfless teachers. Shawqi in his poem praises the efforts of teachers and educators and declares that the primary credit, and listen to this carefully, for whatever advances the country has seen in recent decades goes to these untiring individuals and not to the repressive colonial education policies. And that's interesting because if we were to reflect on the existing educational policies in schools, be they Islamic or otherwise, we need to ask ourselves the extent to which colonial education policies remain, wittingly or unwittingly, being practiced. The second major theme in his poem is knowledge is life. And Shawqi calls for principals and dedicated teachers to rise to the task of nurturing the next generation, to bring them out of the darkness of the ignorance. And he likens ignorance to death. And he sees proper education, and importantly, which includes in his description moral integrity, as the only antidote to the present dilemma of his time. And I'm sure the same might be true for our times. And then he points to the dangers of dishonorable teachers and of an ignorant and principled populace. And lastly, and importantly, the theme of moral pedagogy. He observes that meaningful education cannot be effectively imparted if the teachers themselves are morally impoverished, and also that parents have an important role in the children's moral development. Now, what this says to me is that if I was to summarize the significance and importance of teachers from an Islamic tradition, I would say teaching is a sacred profession. It is not simply a job. It is a sacred profession for which, or because of which, an immense significance is attached to it. And if we were to go quickly through the primary and secondary sources of the Quran, the first word in the Quran was Iqra, and all Muslim writers and educators would say that the revelation of the Quran began by talking about reading, teaching, knowing, and writing. There is the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There is so many hadith. For example, the hadith of the Prophet, he says, وَإِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ مُعَلِّمًا, I have been sent as a teacher. I mean, this on its own, for the Prophet of Allah to say, I have been sent as a teacher, alone is sufficient to allow us to appreciate the significance of the teaching profession and why teachers matter, because of the direct link they have in the sacred duty of their profession to the work and to the mission of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In another amazing hadith, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "Inna Allah lam yab'athani mu'annitan wala muta'annitan, walakin ba'athani mu'alliman wa muyassira." Allah did not send me to be harsh or cause harm, but He has sent me as a teacher so that I may facilitate or make things easy. Again, the significance of being a teacher. The Prophet ﷺ could have described himself in any other words or any other description, but he chose to describe himself as a muallim and a teacher. Muawiyah bin al-Hakam, when he wanted to describe the Prophet, I mean, imagine the awesome responsibility of being asked, describe the Prophet for us. And in one sentence he says, مَا رَأَيْتُ مُعَلِّمًا قَبْلَهُ وَلَا بَعْدَهُ أَحْسَنَ تَعْلِيمًا مِنْهُ. He said, I have never seen a teacher before him or after him better than he, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Again, Muawiyah emphasizes the point that the Prophet himself was a teacher. Elsewhere in Abu Dawood, he says, فَمَا رَأَيْتُ مُعَلِّمًا قَطْ أَرْفَقْ مِنْ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. He says, I have not seen a teacher more gentler and compassionate than the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Again, the Prophet being a teacher, but also his qualities of being compassionate, of being gentle, and of being lenient. Many more ahadith. In this hadith, which is sound, the angels and the dwellers of the heaven and the earth, and even the ant in its hole and the fish, make dua or supplicate in favor of those who teach people good. Now remember, teaching people good is not confined to Muslims only or Muslim teachers only. People who do not identify as Muslim do also good. And though in the Islamic tradition they may not be rewarded for this goodness in the hereafter if they don't have faith, but the scholars all agree that they will be definitely rewarded for their goodness in this life. And so the fact that anyone who teaches people good, and there is no greater good than nurturing the souls and minds of learners, as Ash-Shawqi mentioned, which is the very profession of teachers, hence their worthiness. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi beautifully summed up this when he said, the excellence of teaching and learning is therefore manifest, are therefore manifest. For if knowledge is the most excellent of things, the purpose of acquiring it would then be a search for the most excellent, and imparting it would be promoting the most excellent. I mean, and Imam Ghazali, who needs no introduction, Hujjatul Islam, the proof of Islam, who was instrumental, as many scholars would agree and would argue on, was instrumental in saving the Islamic civilization from, at the time, the onslaught of Greek rational philosophy. And if I was to draw parallels with modern context, we almost need somebody to come and save us from the onslaught of colonial, post-colonial policies on our own schools and our own minds, just as Al-Ghazali at that pivotal point in history was able to, through his brilliance, was able to take the ummah out of falling in the rationalist discourse. Not that he was against rationality, he wasn't, but against certain fundamentals of rationality which went against fundamental aspects of Islam. And equally, if I was to compare our lot today, I would say we are not, and we cannot be against everything that comes to us from other traditions, but we must be mindful that those things that we acquire from other traditions or pedagogies or worldviews must not fundamentally go against the basic principles of our tradition, more so in schools which are meant to nurture the minds and souls of their learners. Historically, Muslim societies place an immense value on teachers. And when they wanted to search for the best madrasa or the best school, it wasn't the size of the library they looked for. It wasn't how much scholarship was given. It wasn't the design of the school, but it was the characteristics in the teacher. Who were the teachers that were teaching in those schools? Again, signifying for us that teachers always mattered. And it is not the buildings that matter. It is not those, though they are important, they are necessary but not sufficient. They're important, but it is not the buildings. It is not the money, the scholarship, but it is the teachers themselves. So why are teachers held in such a high esteem? One, because fundamentally, from an Islamic perspective, teachers are meant to build and nurture souls and minds, and souls come before the minds. And this means that Islam has always looked at teaching and education in itself as not simply a process of transmitting information that is related to the intellect alone, but more significantly, it is about the whole of the child. It is not about transmission, but it is transformation, which involves the spiritual, the intellectual, and the physical. In as far as the intellectual is important, we cannot neglect the intellectual. And Muslim scholars have always argued that reason or the intellect is a prerequisite to the acquisition of knowledge, as well as for the performance of good deeds or righteous deeds. In fact, in Sharia, the principle is inna al-aql asl al-taklif wa madarih, that intellect is the basis of responsibility. A person is not held liable in the presence of Allah or under the law unless they are able to use their reason. They're able to discern between what is right and what is wrong. But aql on its own is not sufficient. Hence, naql is important, revelation is important. But also the physical is very important. And the Prophet ﷺ says, Al-mu'minu al-qawi khayrun wa ahabbu ila Allah min al-mu'min al-da'if. Wa fi kullin khayr. A strong believer is better and more beloved to his creator or her creator than the weak believer. This is to do with the physical aspect. And importantly, perhaps the most important aspect about the role of a teacher, and that which gives them this significance is the responsibility that they have been endowed with to nurture the soul or the spirit. And this is summed up beautifully in the words of the Saint Al-Busti, who says, يا خادم الجسم كم تشقى بخدمته لتطلب الربح فيما فيه خسران أقبل على النفس فاستكمل فضائلها فأنت بالنفس لا بالجسم إنسان. This sums up the Islamic worldview, the Islamic philosophy, if you wish, about the human being and what is the most important thing about him or her. O slave of the body, he says, how you toil to serve it. Where there is nothing but loss, meaning in the physical body, you seek to profit. Turn to the nafs, which you need to perfect. You are a human not by the body, but by the nafs. But if the responsibility and the role and the significance of a teacher is to engage with the nafs, is to have this sacred responsibility of transforming the nafs of the learner, then it is a mighty task. But equally, if it can be achieved, it can be one of the most fulfilling of tasks and professions. And that is why in Islam, knowledge has been related to the sacred, and by extension, being a teacher and the teaching profession itself is intended to achieve one significant aim, and that is of the ma'rifah, or the cognizance of Allah, knowledge and awareness of Allah. And this is directly linked to Shawqi's moral pedagogy, where he observed that meaningful education cannot be effectively imparted if the teachers themselves are bereft of ma'rifah or aspects of ma'rifah, or bereft morally in a sense, but also the parents, which I will come back to. And so in a sense, as my slide shows, this allows for a reframing of the way we need to look at the profession of the teacher, but also of teaching and education itself, from, at the very least, from an Islamic perspective, the reframing of education to being simply, and the role of educator being simply transmission of knowledge, and being a person who is not playing a particular direct sacred role in the transformation of the soul of the learner, to that of one who is directly or playing a role in the transformation of the spiritual aspect of the learner. But that is impossible to achieve unless and until the teacher himself or herself are in tune with a moral pedagogy. Now, the interesting thing is, when the Islamic civilization reframed education to make it centered on sacredness, this led to the formation of new disciplines that weren't necessarily focused only in numeracy, literature and numeracy, but there was something deeper, and that is adab. Because adab is directly linked to deen, the whole, an entire lifestyle. And adab, as many scholars have said, that Al-Mubarak, for example, Abdullah bin Mubarak, the very famous Hanafi jurist, he says, تعلمنا الأدب 30 عاما قبل أن نتعلم الفقه. We learned adab for 30 years before we went and started learning jurisprudence, or the technical aspects of knowledge. Adab is, in the context of behavior, can refer to refinement, good manners, morals, decorum, decency, or humanness. And what is interesting is that in the Islamic civilizations, teachers were trained because of this link to the sacred, that adab includes, proficiency in grammar, but poetry and eloquence and oratory and history and moral philosophy, right? And so the teacher, therefore, has always mattered, because of the transformative role that he or she has played and is playing and can play. And perhaps it links, therefore, to the very purpose for teaching. And if we were to go just quickly for that, teachers are entrusted with the greatest assets, our children. Personally, I truly believe that if we have, as a society, recognized this and believed in this fact, then we would pay the teachers the highest salaries. If truly they are looking after our greatest assets, our children, and they are nurturing their souls and minds, and we believe they are, then is it possible for us as a society to reframe the way we have thought about the education profession? Maybe COVID-19 would help us to do that, post-COVID-19. Can Islamic schools and Islamic education play an instrumental role in the reframing and the reshaping of schooling or education broadly, such that it brings to focus the significance of the sacredness of the role of teaching? But also, if they are looking after our greatest assets, then the greatest responsibility comes with that. And in a sense, teachers in the Islamic tradition, by and large, that is, have felt this sense of responsibility. It is not therefore simply a job, but the worthiness of teaching comes with its sense of responsibility. And this responsibility, before being a responsibility that needs to satisfy the school or satisfy the society, first and foremost, it was meant to satisfy the maker and the creator himself, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there, with that responsibility, of course, comes a number of challenges. Ideally, teachers must embody the transformation they want to see in their learner. But that in itself, from the Islamic worldview at least, makes us believe that teachers always mattered, because their role in the grand scheme of society is the transformation of the best, let's call them assets for a lack of a better word, our own children, who inevitably will change society to the best or the worst. As Shawqi observed, meaningful education cannot be effectively imparted if the teachers themselves are morally impoverished. So let's go back to where we started and sort of wrap up. Fundamentally, teachers mattered because the role of a teacher is the transformation of the learner, and not just transmission of information. But also, teachers always mattered because this sacred duty that they have is a privilege and not an entitlement. It is a trust from Allah for which they will be asked, but if fulfilled, will gain and bring them and the learners the greatest of satisfaction in this world and the next. It is a responsibility. And teachers always mattered because we have always recognized that the learner is at the heart of the education process, right? There is a purpose and an aim. In the Islamic tradition, no one should do any deed without knowing for why they are doing it. That is why intention is so fundamental. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. All actions depend on intentions. Intention drives purpose, and purpose cannot be clear without a clear intention. And that is why when our colleagues like Dr. Nadeem and our brother Dylan and many others speak of an Islamic pedagogy, and one of the distinguishing features and differences perhaps with other pedagogies, one characteristic would be the intention of the teacher. if the role of teachers is connected to the sacred message itself, then knowing why they are doing what they are doing and why they are doing it is also important. And if the learner is at the heart of the education process, then the teacher matters because he or she plays a crucial role in the transformation of the learner. But it is a collective responsibility. And the effort of the entire community must be aligned to achieve this fundamental purpose of education. With the tragic situation of COVID-19, I say tragic, but also there is always a blessing in disguise in these tragedies. Now that the parents are being involved in the learning and in the learning or the education of their students or children at home, now the whole community is realizing, wow, you know, the amazing role that the teachers played, but also the fact that the nurturing of a learner is not only the sole responsibility of the teacher, but this is an entire community's effort. And perhaps schools, including Islamic schools, can begin to rethink post-COVID-19, how might we engage with this community in better ways to allow us to nurture the mind and the soul of the learner? And coming back to Shawqi, who says in his poetry, and also that parents have an important role in their children's moral development. Now, whilst that is easy to say, of course, the question that begs itself, how might we empower those teachers to do this? How might we empower those parents to do this? What sort of reciprocal relationship can exist between, let's say, Islamic schools and the parents? And not simply having a tokenistic relationship with parents. Knowing that the fundamental purpose of learning or education in Islam is the transformation of this learner. And knowing that parents play a crucial role, and so do teachers, what relationship can we build and develop between those in ways that are conducive and constructive, that can allow us to arrive or achieve this aim? Why this is crucial? Simply because it takes a village to raise a child. Right? A verb that we have all heard, a proverb, an African proverb. So to summarize and end, and that is smack bang half an hour on my presentation, that is, teachers have always mattered. And inshallah, this significance of the teacher will stay with us forever post-COVID-19 and allow us to reshape and reframe our perceptions and views of their sacred duties, but also the interdependent relationship they have with the learner and the parents. They mattered because of the purpose they fulfill. They mattered because they are an amazing instrument that can lead to wonderful transformations of the learner, but also, and more importantly, because from an Islamic tradition, teachers mattered because of the direct link they have to the sacred mission and tradition of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We just finally, this is just a quick slide to tell you about the other webinars that we have. So 6th of May 2020, and Ramila would be very happy that I'm mentioning this. 11 a.m. Islamic law, COVID-19 and biomedical issues. 13th of May 2020, the hallmark of leadership. And the 20 May 2020, the fiqh of pandemics. Please join us. This is a set of readings that you are most welcome to refer to. Some by myself and my colleagues, Islamic Schooling in the West, Pathways to Renewal. Brother Chown there, Towards Authentic Behavior Management. Brother Nadim Memons, Dr. Nadim Memons, Philosophy of Islamic Education. But if you do have time, I would highly also recommend Maqdisi's Scholasticism and Humanism in Classical Islam and in the Christian West. There is a journal article, but it is the book that you really want. If you can get your hands on that book, then it gives you a brilliant historical perspective on the rise of scholasticism and humanism in the Islamic tradition, and in doing so speaks about the rise of madrasas and schools and maktabs and eventually universities, and raises some of the very points that I have raised in my discussion. That is my time over. Thank you so much for listening, and I am happy to take your questions. Ramila is happy to take your questions too, but also other colleagues who are here. We have 15 minutes probably to have questions. Is that correct, Ramila?
Yes, that is correct.
Excellent.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah, I just, it's very interesting, and I basically got interested in the topic because I'm a teacher, in the first instance, obviously. Now, my concern is the issues that we are facing in the Islamic world in respect to the madrasas, and the whole profession of the teaching has been reduced to the memorization, and the teachers obviously are not focusing on the thinking skills and allowing students to question.
Right.
So, and this has reduced our whole community into the people who just memorize this stuff and don't use the mind at all.
Right. Okay.
Where this come from?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for that question. And I wouldn't. And whilst there is, whilst your question is valid, I wouldn't confine that to madrasas only. And we can't certainly generalize and say all madrasas do that. There are some madrasas that, alhamdulillah, are excellent and doing a great job. And it depends also on our definition of madrasa. For example, Dr. Nadwi has written an excellent small treatise, a small book on the madrasa of Darul Uloom Lucknow in India. But that is a madrasa different to our understanding of the typical madrasa that is perhaps attached to a masjid. And in his book, he speaks beautifully about the nurturing and the critical thinking and the logic and the mantiq and the jurisprudence that they have undertaken in that type of madrasa. But I understand your point, and I would probably say the move away from, in inverted commas, critical thinking in the Islamic tradition began to happen perhaps post, and some scholars would say post the 16th century, in fact. Others would say in the last 200 years after the colonial experience or after colonization. And one of the reasons is that because of colonization, Islamic schools and madrasas closed doors and they became protective, and they simply wanted to conserve and reserve and protect what they have without being exposed to anything else. And some people might say that was valid for the time. But I think generally, if we are fair in our criticism and our feedback, generally speaking, their madrasas, whether in Muslim majority nations or in Western context, to a large degree, have focused only on perhaps very important aspects of the tradition, memorization of the Quran and basic fiqh and basic sharia. But from our studies of these curricula or these approaches, we have found two primary problems. One, the content of what is being delivered is often not relevant to the lives of these students, or it's not being contextualized. And we need to think about that, whether in the form of a madrasa or Islamic studies in Islamic schools. And secondly, the pedagogical approaches that are being used, sometimes they are, if not all the times, can be somewhat outdated and perhaps not effective and relevant to the lives of those students. So these are areas that our scholars and colleagues are working on to see how might we build on this tradition, wonderful tradition, but improve it in a way.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Prof, we have a couple of questions in the chat. There's one from Dr. Adha. It says, how do we nurture a moral student in the age of massive technological disruption?
Yes, excellent question. And I'm trying to go back to these chats, right? That's a very good question, but also it perhaps it requires the whole school to reflect on their own approach. Whilst the emphasis is on the teacher, but clearly the teacher cannot do this on their own, and maybe refocusing on priorities of the schools themselves. What is the intended vision or outcome of these schools? Often we see lofty visions that speak of moral development and civic involvement, but in actual reality, the pressures of existing policies on teachers and the demand of time and technology prevent us from achieving those objectives. And so what I and my colleagues have been arguing for, and that is a renewal perhaps of schools, particularly Islamic schools, where the entire school's stakeholders need to go and rethink one, the vision, secondly, to what extent the vision has been attained and how might we attain that vision. And if moral development and the moral imperative is foremost in our schools, then maybe a realignment of our schools' policies and strategies needs to be discussed thoroughly. Now, that does not, the use of technology does not or should not be a barrier from achieving some of those aims and objectives if the use of technology aligns with clear objectives that the school has that intend to achieve those moral imperative outcomes. Is like to ask question regarding early childhood. Nurturing the child is the only way that opens the emotional side, and this is the true beginning to a child before trying anything else. Is this true foundation? Thank you, Brother Ali, for asking that question. Absolutely, and it's one, interestingly, in the Islamic tradition, the view of the child is so important, but it is diametrically different in many ways to the conventional Western perspectives on the child. Now, both perspectives speak highly about the rights of the child, right? The place of the child. In the Islamic narrative, the right or the place of the child begins before, in fact, inception or conception, right? It begins in the parents themselves. It begins in the nurturing of the parents, in what they, in their own spiritual state, in their own moral state, in what they consume, in what they read, in what they eat, because all of that will ultimately have an impact, and obviously science is beginning to prove that impact on the embryo during its development stage. But furthermore, what Islam also advocates that whilst in the embryo, this child has huge rights and the parents have massive responsibility in nurturing this child. And the minute this child is born, he or she are entitled to fundamental and basic rights. Foremost among those is proper moral, spiritual education. And so the building blocks begin with the child. And at times we leave it too late when the child has not been given this grounding and this background, if you wish. And then we begin to worry about why things are not going the way we want with our children. You know, bringing a child, some Muslim scholars have beautifully said, you know, nurturing a child is like nurturing a baby horse, if you like. And if you want this horse to grow with certain features and characteristics, then you must nurture it in a way that leads to that and not leave it to chance. So yes, I agree with you, Brother Ali, and certainly it begins with the children. And some Muslim psychologists and experts in ilm al-nafs, the ilm of tazkiyah and purification of the soul, would in fact argue that sadly, when it comes to things like driving a car, we all know that you can't just jump in a car and drive it, but you need to learn theoretically and practically how to drive a car before you drive it. But when it comes to the nurturing of our children, we somehow assume that we can just jump into it and be able to nurture our children. And that is a fallacy. We have to learn in theory and in practice, what does it mean to nurture a child and bring a child up, certainly in this world that we live in and any other time. And that is why the responsibility is huge on both.
Thank you, Professor. You can hear me clearly?
Of course I can hear you and recognize the voice.
It's thank you. Assalamu alaikum. The main thing that I'd like to just quickly touch upon is because any form of education logically can't actually work until the emotional side of the brain has developed, which only happens in those first 5 or 6 years. And I just don't see that there's enough being spoken about in this situation, because like you said, it is a big responsibility from the moment the child is in the womb of the mother, and and the fluid that it sits in, subhanallah, it makes such a big difference. So the diet is so important, and all these things are happening. And being the director of the childcare centers, we're seeing a lot more of these issues that are happening with children, because I believe the discipline is starting probably too early, and the nurture isn't being isn't there, and infants only want is connection, or is nurture, and until that is done correctly, and I mind me if I speak out of school here, but I feel like it's like almost a not a responsibility, or it's a I'm going to use the word fashion. It's a fashion to just have 5, 6, 7, 8 children and not give them the correct nurture, but expect them to be a genius, when they get to school, when, before they become a genius, which is the logical side of the brain, they need the emotional side of the brain, because there's no balance if it's not. And I just feel like there should be a little bit more. And I know there's a lot of science behind it, and I know Islamically there's a lot of science, and there's been, definitely parts of the Quran that say the same thing as well, about the weaning period between the mother and the child being of 30 months. So it's extremely important, but I don't think it's recognized, and people want their child just to be an elite something in later in life, without giving them the foundations in early life.
Yeah, no, you put it very nicely and very well. It's interesting that you mentioned that. We know in the sound hadith that the Prophet ﷺ says, for the first 7 years of their lives, they are children, and you deal with them as such. It's that nurturing and that spiritual, emotional nurturing that is so valued and so important. And before starting to give instructions, it is that emotional resilience, emotional development, spiritual development that is so important. But that needs to be modeled. And, I think one of the biggest tragedies is that our institutions, whether they are schools or madrasas or universities or whatever they might be, have neglected perhaps the helping parents to become those role models in the houses that can nurture the child in ways that you have described. And but also, perhaps some parents feel, well, this responsibility of nurturing is for somebody else to do. And this is the reframing that we need to begin to think about. I personally do not support this, some very strict instructional approaches with children, because they need what you have spoken about. And there is no doubt there is a strong tradition, a very rich tradition in Islam that deals with early childhood and so forth, and this is not the time for it. Perhaps we can bring somebody in the future to talk about that, inshallah. Somebody
Inshallah.
specialist in the field, yeah.
Thank you.
Somebody's got their hand up. Please go ahead and ask.
Professor Abdalla, this is Kelly Cato from Malik Fard Islamic School in Sydney.
How are you, sister?
I'm very well, thank you. I was very interested in your thoughts about collective responsibility and the role of the school in working with parents. And I'd like to get your thoughts on how you would go about building that relationship with parents from very diverse, culturally diverse Islamic backgrounds. Any tips?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. We have certainly encountered this problem with all Islamic schools that we have worked with. My colleague, Dylan Chown and Dr. Nadeem, certainly we've come across this. And one of the biggest problems, sisters, we have found between schools and teachers is the lack of trust. Often because teachers or parents are not engaged as partners in the school, but as clients. That needs to change. We often found, and this is empirical data, this is not anecdotal, though it is supported anecdotally, is that whenever schools, and at least these are the schools that we have engaged with, and I don't want to generalize, but this is the case of very few, very large Islamic schools that we engage with, is that often when parents are engaged or involved, it is superficial. It is inviting them to certain events, but not, involving them in certain decision-making issues. It's not involving them in shaping the vision of the school, for example. We don't involve them in shaping the philosophy of the school. We don't ask them about what they actually think about how things are going in the school. Independent review, not from these teachers themselves. Bring somebody to independently ask them. And when we did that, what we found, sister, is that parents have always said Islamic schools are important, but Islamic schools are concerned only about academic performance, and they're not fundamentally concerned about other major issues that we are worried about. So perhaps as a first step is to begin to change the nature of relationship to make it more wholesome. And I'm not saying go and invite the 5,000 members of the community, but a genuine invitation, for example, to have a focus group to examine, starting with, as an example, the vision of your school. A select number of parents, they say, here is our vision, let's talk about it. And often you'll find that even despite the differences among the diversity of Muslim community, whether in terms of madhabs or in terms of sects, they agree on the fundamental premises on which Islamic schools need to stand, right? Because we're not discussing the theological aspects. We're talking about vision, we're talking about mission, and whilst there might be some differences, we will come to some common terms. So building trust with parents, being transparent with our parent community, right? Engaging in a wholesome way with our community. To give you another example, every time we did a independent review for Islamic schools and we handed the report to the school, most often they did not share these findings with the parents. In the one instance when a school did share the findings with the parents, though the findings were quite challenging, the response of the parents were, they said this was an unbelievable brave step of the school to have external examiners or external reviewers to look at what they do, and we congratulate you for this, and we feel so empowered and proud of the fact that the school has been transparent with us and shared with us the strengths, but also the weaknesses and the challenges that the school is going through. Allahu Alam.
Thank you very much.
You are most welcome. I know there's a lot of questions there, and I'm trying to go through them, but if you have a question you can ask, please do so. Some question.
Professor, sorry, can I just interject? One of the first questions in the chat was, sometimes teachers may lose their temper or become impatient.
Yes.
Students, do you think that the teachers sometimes need
mentoring? Of course, we all need mentors, and you know, when we speak about teachers being able to nurture the lives of the students, and they themselves need to be spiritually nurtured, we're not also talking about a perfect human being who is not going to falter and make mistakes, right? The fact that a teacher is patient most of his or her time, and sometimes they may lose that patience, that is not the problem. The problem is if impatience is a permanent characteristic, if impatience or disrespect of the child or the learner, or the not showing dignity towards the learner, if that is a permanent feature of the teacher, then that is problematic. But if it is an infrequent occurrence, then that is normal. But yes, there needs to be mentoring, but also there needs to be continual learning, continual, if we can call it, professional development, right? Now, again, if I may, and I'm not raising this to be, critical of schools generally and Islamic schools particularly, but again, from our empirical data, empirical engagement with Islamic schools, what we have found is often when there are professional development sessions for teachers, often they are not related to the moral, spiritual nurturing of the teachers themselves. But it is often, how to teach best and how to do numeracy best and how to do pedagogy best and so forth. And I think this is fundamentally because the vision for which schools were established in the first instance is not really being focused on. The vision of a morally, spiritually whole-rounded learner, which sounds lofty and ideal and fantastic. The truth of the matter, sadly, and I say this not by way of criticism, but by way of seeing how can we renew our schools, sadly, the focus often is on the academic performance, and the pressure on teachers also is on that. In doing so, something has to be sacrificed. And in this case, that which is sacrificed is the focus on the spiritual, on the soul, on the moral, on the ethical, and so forth. When there is some discussion or involvement of schools in these matters, it is often scattered, not focused, superficial, and sprinkling of these things. So yes, mentoring is required, but it is not for teachers only. In fact, my colleagues and I would argue that the leaders of the school, the executive board of the school, the principal of the school, the deputy principal of the school, everybody who's involved in a school, even the lady or the man in the canteen and the bus driver, must all be aligned in understanding the vision and must all receive certain mentoring to help them achieve the vision for which these schools were established in the first place. We have about 5 minutes, unless you want to keep going. Of course, Ramila is the boss, and she will decide how we go with that.
There is an Arabic writing here, Prof.
That's for you, Ramila.
It'll be very difficult for me to answer any of
okay,
that.
I'm looking at that. Yes. So one of the questions in Arabic says that, he says, from my humble experience with schools, is that it is not only the teachers who have the responsibility of nurturing the shakhsiyya or the personality of a Muslim learner or the learner, nor is it enough to have theory on, on social media and online, but rather the mas'ulun, or the responsible people for the school, the very people I just mentioned before, themselves need to practice tarbiyah in their schools. In other words, he's saying, I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, he's saying those responsible for the school need to embody this tarbiyah before trying to even impart it through ta'aleem, through instruction. And of course, I agree with that, but that doesn't mean, if we haven't fully grasped tarbiyah in our embodied tarbiyah in ourselves, we cannot begin to pursue schooling or open schools. We can do it concurrently. So yes, I agree with that. Everybody who is responsible for the school must embody the very principles and the vision for which the school has been established. Then the other question is, yes, he says, given that this is the question is, given that most teachers in our Islamic schools are under immense pressure and they have high level of anxiety, or they are anxious all the time, this is what the questioner is saying, how are they going to nurture our children? Do we expect that they have time to bring this nurturing and the spiritual nurturing in our children? And not every teacher is a murabbi, not every teacher is a nurturer. Absolutely, and I agree with that. And I agree with the fact that pressures on teachers are immense. But perhaps going back to maybe what I have said in my presentation, this reframing and rethinking of the aims and objectives of our school may help us then reprioritize. Maybe if the aim is not only academic performance but other things, then maybe we can take some of that pressure off and so forth. But it comes back, my understanding is that it comes back to how we view the school, what is the vision of the school, what do we want it to achieve, and not simply having a stated vision that looks ideal and lofty, but how do we enact it, and have we enacted it? And again, with due respect, all the schools that we have engaged with, we have found that not only do stakeholders do not know the vision of their school, but they haven't actually enacted that vision, or they have enacted a very small part of that vision, and that is the intellectual or academics of that vision. And it is true that not every teacher is a murabbi, that is true, but every teacher can have some qualities and characteristics that is common, that can allow the teachers of a given school to achieve a common vision of a school. Our colleague, Sheikh Abdullah, who is in Sydney, has done an amazing work on synthesis of pedagogies, Islamic pedagogy and other productive pedagogies. And he's come up with what he calls a prophetic pedagogy, which is essentially a framework for teachers in Islamic schools, whether they are Muslim or of non-Muslim background. It's a language, it's a meta language, it's certain principles that every teacher must embody to be able to help in the nurturing of those students, without the teacher himself or herself being necessarily a murabbi, a nurturer, right? In fact, who among us is a murabbi? A murabbi is a very difficult thing to attain, but we can have certain traits, certain characteristics and principles, a meta language, a meta pedagogy, an Islamic pedagogy, if you like, that can be translated within a school to allow all teachers to engage with, deal with this learner in a way that is consistent with our fundamental philosophies of education and our Islamic vision. It is 12 o'clock, so technically we should stop the session, and those who would like to leave, they are most welcome to do so. And those who would like to stay behind for a few more minutes, you are more than welcome to do so also. Thank you everybody for participating. And I hope this session has been useful. And inshallah ta'ala, you continue to engage with us and we continue to engage with you. Please remember, we do have sessions every week. All of our colleagues, wonderful colleagues, have sessions weekly on every Wednesday, correct, Ramila? And if you're interested to know more about what SITE does, please visit our website and just go to University of South Australia website and search for SITE, C-I-T-E, and Ramila has put a reference to our website on the chat.
Excellent from Malik Fard. Thank you very much. Most grateful and always insightful.
You are most welcome, Bruce. Good to have you. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. مرحبا بالشيخ عبد الله.
اهلا وسهلا.
كيف الحال؟
الحمد لله. يطمنون عنكم.
طيبون الله يحفظكم. كيف الصحة؟
الحمد لله. سامحوني يا دكتور انشغلت طرأ امر تحت مع
لا بأس.
I just had to rush.
لا بأس.
I didn't forget. I had it on my reminder, but معذرة والله فاتني.
لا بأس لا بأس. أنت أستاذنا يا شيخ عبد الله. ما تحتاج. You don't need this seminar. You're our teacher ما شاء الله. بارك الله فيكم على الحضور. الله يحفظكم. جزاكم الله خير.
By any chance, Professor Mohamad, will the slides be available on the website at all?
Yeah, I will share them, inshallah, and the recordings, inshallah.
Excellent, inshallah. I'll go back to it. Jazakallah khair.
حفظكم الله. الله يبارك فيكم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
السلام عليكم.
السلام ورحمة الله.